So throughout Unit 7, we've been concentrating mostly on the history of Europe. And when we talk about Europe, we're slowly pulling Europe out of the Middle Ages and we're building it into something that's much more modern, much more like what we have now in 2020. Um, but last week we took a look at a different part of the planet. We took a look at the New World and we talked about three civilizations that were there, the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca. And as impressive as these three civilizations were in their time, they're not going to be able to withstand what happens next. And what happens next actually has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with what's going on the other side of the planet back in Europe. So while Europe is going through its Renaissance, while it's going through its Reformation, it's also beginning a process of exploration. And so that's what we're going to be looking at for the next few lessons. We'll start it today on this idea of the age of exploration. So our two big questions for today, number one, why did European explorers begin to explore the New World? And then secondly, what new technologies allowed these Europeans to begin exploring the world? So like we've seen many times, technology is going to play a big role today. But as we talk about this thing called the age of exploration, I want you to keep something very important in mind. Remember, this is all going on at the same time. So while the Reformation is kicking into gear, while the Renaissance is still going on, Europeans are also beginning to explore the world. So these three events, Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Exploration, they're all going on at the same time in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and even into the 1600s. And a lot of this that we're going to be talking about today has to do with trade. So trade's been a common theme that we've seen throughout Unit 7. I mean, we talked about how trade with the Middle East and Europe kicks into gear shortly after the Crusades. It makes enough money that they can kick into the Renaissance. Um, so again, remember, during the Renaissance, the Europeans are trading pretty heavily with the Middle East. They're also trading with each other, so they're also trading with other Europeans. But most of the trade in Europe is going to be focused on the Mediterranean Sea. So it's going to be that big body of water between Europe, Africa, and Asia. And they're trading with the Middle East because they want all the things that the Middle Easterners have. They want things like soap. They want things like spices. They want things like incense and all sorts of exotic fruits and animals and all this. So they want all the stuff that's coming from the Middle East. But eventually Europe begins to figure out the Middle East are really, I mean, that region is just kind of the middleman. What they really want is to trade with India and China because all the real stuff, all the real wealth is coming from India and China. The Middle East is just sort of making it happen. So the Middle East would trade with India and China, and then they would turn around and they would trade that stuff back to Europe. So Europe starts to say, well, we can cut out the middleman and we can just trade directly with China and India. But there's a small problem that's going on at this time. And by small, I mean actually it's pretty massive. Between Europe and Asia at this time was the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire, usually we spend a lot more time talking about the Ottomans, but just given everything that's going on, we'll sort of just kind of boil this down. The Ottoman Empire was a massive empire, absolutely enormous empire that existed in Europe and Asia and Africa. So if you take a look at the map that's all the way over there, you can see, you know, in that gold color, they're huge. They're a big chunk of dirt. And the Ottomans are Muslim. And Europe at this point was kind of racist. And they didn't really want to be trading with Muslims. Um, Plus, the Ottomans made them very nervous. They saw the Ottomans as a threat. The Ottomans were continually expanding. Their border kind of brought them right up against the Holy Roman Empire or Germany. And this made not only the Holy Roman Emperor nervous and the Pope nervous, but everybody in Europe nervous. The Ottomans tried to invade several times. They get turned back for a couple silly reasons, but they were a force to be reckoned with because it was actually the Ottomans who finally took down the Byzantine Empire, or at least what was left of it, in 1453. They essentially blew up the walls of Constantinople with these massive cannons, and they just sort of steamrolled through. So the Europeans are very nervous about trading with the Ottomans. They don't want to give them any more money than they have to, but they've kind of got to get through the Ottomans in order to get to India and China, or at least so they thought. So in the late 1400s, this is the situation that we're looking at right here. So what you've got on the left there is a map. It's a map from this time period. Again, we're talking late 1400s, early 1500s. But notice the shape of this map. It's not flat. It's circular. The people during this time were not morons. They knew that the world was a giant sphere. This whole idea that was probably shoved into your head during kindergarten that like Columbus was out to prove the world was round, everyone else thought it was flat. It's baloney. It's not true at all. And we'll talk more about Columbus in a little while, and I'll try to keep it as short as I possibly can because I hate the man. But if you notice, it's circular. It's kind of a weird shape because you have to pull it apart to look at it. But they knew that the world was circular. The problem is they just didn't know how big the world was. And we'll talk to this in just a second. But this is a very crude but very important map that shows us how they saw the world. So here's what we've got here. This up there is supposed to be Christian Europe. So that's France and Portugal and Spain and England, and that's Christian Europe. Down here you've got Africa, which of course makes this Asia. Now if you look, that's the world that they know about. So your only way into Asia from Europe is through the Ottoman Empire. Well, that's a pain in the butt. I mean, that's literally the only way that you can go. Usually at this point, people are like, well, why can't they just go up through Russia? Because Russia's cold and it's miserable. You don't go through Russia to trade. That's a terrible idea. You go through the Ottoman Empire because they at least know what the heck they're doing. So this is the problem that we see. There's just not enough of the map known to get from Europe over to Asia without going through the Ottomans or through the Russians. But we're not going to trade with the Russians. It's a terrible idea. So Europeans start to look for new ways around the Ottomans. They want to try and bypass the Ottomans. And it seems like the easiest way to do that is going to be to go around Africa. But again, nobody knew how big Africa was, and it hadn't been explored. So Europeans, again, this is something they wanted to, but could they do it? Well, that's the bigger question because European boats during this time were honestly pretty crappy. Some of the biggest and heaviest boats that they had were called hulks or sometimes cogs, and they were not great. They tended to be smaller, they tended to be fragile, they could be easily destroyed if seas got rough. So Europeans needed some new technology. And fortunately, there's a bunch of different technologies that will help them with this. Now, through trade, through basic cultural diffusion, they start to see things like the rudder and the compass. Now, remember, these were two designs that came from China. They were able to be spread across Asia by the Mongols. The Mongols took over almost all of Asia for a time, and their greatest contribution was that they start to spread all this Chinese stuff. So the Europeans suddenly get things like rudders and compasses. Then they also get a bunch of new stuff. They get things like the astrolabe, which is this guy right up here. Then I'll explain that in just a second. They get all sorts of navigational charts and maps. And they also get these things called lateen sails. Now, all three of these things were from the Muslim world. So they were things that had been invented in the Middle East. Now, an astrolabe, again, that device right up there, is really used to determine your location. So it's a device that you can kind of like spin it. You can look up at the stars based on what you see, and you can actually get a good sense of your latitude. North and south, which is pretty important. There's also the lateen sails, which honestly dates all the way back to like the Romans, but the Muslims had kind of perfected it. But it's this triangular shaped sail that actually allows you to move your boat into the wind. Instead of always having to rely on the wind being at your back, you can actually sail into it, which is going to be really important when you don't know where you're going. Now, European countries also started to make much better maps on their own. They also started to make much stronger boats, and boats that were much more seaworthy. Now, the picture that I'm partially covering up with my little video here is of a boat called a caravel. And a caravel, they were first designed in Portugal, but they start to kind of trickle their ideas elsewhere. It's a pretty strong, pretty seaworthy European boat, and it's going to use all of these new technologies. So you'll see rudders, you'll see lateen sails, they'll be using compasses and astrolabes. And so all of a sudden we have the stuff that we need in order to begin to explore. Now we just need the people. So Portugal is going to be really the first major country to start exploring, and there's a couple of different reasons for this. For one, their leader, a guy by the name of Prince Henry the Navigator, who's not the king, he's a prince. He actually opened up a special school to start training explorers so they could do this kind of stuff. The other thing about Portugal, excuse me, is it's so stinking close to Africa. So you think about where Portugal is on a map. It's pretty far out into the Atlantic. They're just in a good geographic spot to start exploring things like Africa. So it's really Africa that's going to be able to find a route all the way. I'm losing my brain today. It's really Portugal that's going to be able to find a route all the way around Africa and over to India. And the first guy who does this, a guy by the name of Vasco da Gama, excuse me. Vasco da Gama is going to make so much money because he finds the quick way to Africa or to India, that every other country is going to say like, oh my God, I have to do this too. So we start to come up with this like race to see who can find the best and most effective routes to India and China. So Spain will follow very shortly after Portugal, and then England gets involved, and then France gets involved, and the Dutch get involved, and then everybody wants a piece of this action. So very quickly we're going to have this like spiral as to, this giant snowball effect as to who's actually going to be exploring the world. But it does start with Portugal. I swear, technology today, not my friend. All right, so the first guy to do this, I had just dropped his name a second ago. The first guy to go all the way around Africa was a dude by the name of Vasco da Gama. He's from Portugal. He went all the way around the tip of Africa, the southern tip, and into the Indian Ocean. He finally found a way to the Ottomans. And he makes it all the way to India. And like I said, he makes absolute bank on this. He makes a ton of money, 6,000% markup on pretty much what he was able to do, which just means, if you gave him $1, you got $6,000 back in investment money, which might mean nothing to you. But long story short, he made a whole lot of money going around Africa and into India. And so very quickly after this, Spain realizes that they've got to get in on this. And then, I hate talking about this, man. There's another explorer by the name of Christopher Columbus, and contrary to what they taught you in kindergarten, he was not out to prove that the world was round. He was out to prove that his bad math was right. So Christopher Columbus in 1492 famously went to the King of Spain and said, hey, I've got a better idea. I think if we sailed west into the Atlantic Ocean, we'd eventually pop out in China, particularly down in Indonesia, which were then called the Spice Islands. And everyone was like, hold up, dude, your math is really bad. Because people had known for really forever, since the Greeks, that the world was about 25,000 miles around. In fact, it was pretty well documented, and it's also what we know to be true today in 2020. Well, Columbus had done his own math and said, I think the world is about 15,000 miles, which means he was off by 10,000 miles. But he was pretty convinced that if he sailed west, he would just pop right out over by China and he would be able to trade there, and it'd be way easier than just going around Africa. So he went to the King and Queen of Spain and he tried to prove it to them, and they were like, we're just going to give you 3 crappy boats and you're probably going to die, but have fun. So he did, and he's an Italian explorer. He's sailing on behalf of Spain. And he does sail west into the Atlantic, and he does find land, but it's not the land that he thinks he's finding. He accidentally discovers the New World. By the way, he went to his deathbed thinking that he was still right. He refused to acknowledge the fact that he had just found 2 new continents. That was the nicest rant that I could have gone on about Columbus, because I usually eats at class period. We're just going to move on. So you've got Vasco da Gama, finds his way around Africa. We've got Christopher Columbus. He accidentally discovers the New World. And then you've also got another Portuguese guy by the name of Ferdinand Magellan, who's actually going to be the first, once they've figured out North and South America, he's going to be the first to what we call circumnavigate, which means to sail completely around the world. Now, what's silly about saying that Ferdinand Magellan is the one who sailed around the world is he actually died along the way. He died in the Philippines. So his corpse made it around the world. His crew made it around the world, but he chickened out and died. Whatever. Also, when we're talking about very, very famous explorers, yes, you've got Da Gama, you've got Columbus, you've got Magellan. Don't forget about Dora. I mean, Dora is very essential to this. You know, she helps out small cartoon animals, has a magical talking backpack, the map. You gotta love the map song. Frequently travels around with a monkey named Boots. Don't forget, she does have rivals, though. There's Swiper, there's Diego. Allegedly, they're cousins. I don't know. Also, if you're writing this down, what is wrong with you? This is a joke. This isn't even a funny joke. We're just moving on. So effectively, this is what we're looking at. So these are the early explorers. Again, Columbus is going back and forth from the New World. Da Gama is heading all the way over to India, and Magellan is going to, at least his corpse, is going to make it all the way around the planet. So these are some of these early famous explorers, and what they're doing is they're really figuring out, you know, the edges of that map that we saw. They're pushing the boundaries. They're trying to figure out what else is there. And very early on, I mean, I mentioned some Portuguese explorers and I mentioned some Spanish explorers. Pretty early on, Spain and Portugal start to have a little bit of a rivalry as to who's going to find the coolest stuff, especially once both countries begin to actually take over the regions that they're finding. In fact, it got so heated. And pretty early into this, I mean, you're talking 2 years into this thing, 1494, it gets so heated that the Pope at the time had to get involved. Now, both Portugal and Spain were super Catholic. There's not many Protestants here. So the Pope creates a treaty known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's not the Treaty of Tortillas. It's the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And effectively what it does is it picks a line in the New World. And the Pope pretty much says, okay, Portugal, you can have everything east of that line. Spain, you can have everything west of that line. And that really actually seems like a bad deal for the Portuguese. Honestly, at the time was a bad deal for the Spanish because they didn't know how much land was out there and they knew about all the stuff that the Portuguese got. So if you take a look at the map that I've got there, you'll see that the line, Treaty of Tordesillas, it's the purple line, it goes right through what is today Brazil. Now, if you know anything about Latin America, what's going on pretty much Mexico and southward, most people in Latin America speak Spanish. Why? Because these are the lands that the Spanish are going to be able to take over. And we'll talk more about this later on, actually, in our next video. So why does Brazil speak Portuguese? Well, guess what? Most of Brazil falls on the Portuguese side of that Treaty of Tordesillas, and so this will be Portuguese turf. So hang on to this thought, this Treaty of Tordesillas. We're going to come back to this because this is going to be pretty important. But let's wrap this up with a very, very key idea. Why the heck are people exploring? Why is it that people are willing to risk their lives to sail out into the middle of freaking nowhere hoping to get something out of this? So regardless of what country they're coming from, there's pretty much three reasons. There's three reasons why these European explorers did what they did. And we usually call these the three Gs. First, glory. I mean, everybody wants to be famous. Everybody wants to, you know, make themselves and sometimes their country look good. And so all these people went out hoping to be the first to find something cool. In fact, sometimes these explorers would come up with ridiculous stories just to push people and to get them to go out there and look for things. So I'm sure you've heard stories of like El Dorado or the Fountain of Youth. As crazy as these stories were, it actually motivated people to go out and to try and look for stuff. So glory is the first G. Second one is God. They want to spread Christianity to new people because as people like Columbus, as people, you know, like Da Gama or whatever, get out there and they start seeing new lands, they realize, these people don't know Jesus. So the Catholic Church, especially when it's trying to work its way around what's going on in the Reformation, and eventually the Protestants will follow them in this, they realize, hey, there's an opportunity to spread Christianity to people who have never heard of Christianity before. So we've got glory, we've got God, And then lastly, we've got gold. I mean, people just want to be rich. Everybody wants to be rich. Everybody wants a load of cash. And certainly the people who were out there exploring and finding new trade routes, they were making a whole lot of money. The other thing is, as they start exploring the new world, they start to realize that there's a lot of sources of gold and silver in the ground that can be mined. And that's another way to get rich. So glory, God, gold, these are the three G's. This is why these Europeans are willing to risk their lives to go and explore a planet that really they're just starting to get familiar with. So we'll leave this all right there for right now. We'll pick up on what happens when Spain meets people like the Aztecs and the Incas next time. But for now, have an awesome day. See you later. Bye.